Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by MX Publishing. With the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world, new novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them online at mxpublishing.com.
Also by Dan Andriacco Mysteries, featuring Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody. Check out their new second casebook called Murderer's Row. More information at danandriacco.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 205. Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are here not to play games with you, but, well, to talk about playing games with you or with anyone who will participate. Bert, are you a gamesman?
Yes, I love playing games. I felt, in our conversation with Dave Neale, we had such an interesting discussion about play. I feel that I'm a very playful person, but who knows what other people think.
Well, I think it comes through here on the show. You don't mince words. You do play games, but not in that sense. I don't mince words, but I tend to chop them up pretty fine. There you go. What am I? Chopped words? Before we get into the meat of the subject today, and before we get into the housekeeping that you're so accustomed to hearing at the top of the show here, we did want to provide a little announcement, a little change that's happening to our Patreon community. There are a number of you who support I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and Trifles, our other show, on Patreon and also on PayPal. And these are two disparate ways of supporting us and don't necessarily provide the same ability for us on the administrative end to provide you with all of the benefits that we want. And we've had a number of things in terms of, when you support us on Patreon, not only does it make transcripts possible, and we're in the process of going through our back transcripts here, but it also gives you the opportunity to, on a regular basis, support us and get rewards, things like stickers and mugs and coasters and whatnot. But we thought it might be time to change that up a little bit, to change the structure, to change the cadence. And we're going to have an announcement on Patreon in January when we will be changing it from a per episode payment to a per month basis, which is the way we do it on Trifles as well. And we're going to open up an online community for all of our supporters so we can communicate with you directly and provide you inside information, background, give you the coveted outtakes episode that we produce every year, which will be steeped in hilarity, no doubt, as well as errors. And we will use those online communities as a way to kind of provide additional value to you. So we'll be putting together new tiers of membership. We'll be making it, I would hope, a little more affordable, a little more interesting for people, and perhaps even changing our tchotchke model, where we give you access to the store and give you discounts there rather than simply just throwing stuff at you like tote bags and mugs and whatnot. So if you have any feedback on that, if you have any interest, if you have any input that you'd like to give us, please email us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. It should be a pretty exciting time in 2021. What do you think, Bert?
I think so. And, we haven't talked about some of the interesting new premiums and gifts that we've been exploring. And I am particularly pleased on the first run of the custom Stradivariuses that we've gotten in from Italy. I think people are really going to love them.
No doubt. No doubt. And, if we could only find one for 55 shillings again, it would actually significantly improve our profit margins, which are always threadbare. Well, if you would like to get in touch with us for any reason, not only to talk about our supporter community, but, just to give us feedback or give us show ideas or whatever is on your mind, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us through email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can find the show notes for this particular episode at ihose.co/ihose205. And you can, of course, find us on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on Facebook as I Hear of Sherlock. We look forward to your feedback. And it's also worth noting that over on Trifles, if you've been following there, we've eclipsed ourselves. That's right. We now have more Trifles episodes that have been produced than we do iHose, or I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episodes. It's a remarkable thing. And now, collectively, we are at over 410 episodes that we have produced of Sherlockian podcasts.
Amazing. And somewhere we will eventually get transcripts of all of them. We will print them all out, collate them. And I've set aside a table in part of my house with a 3-ring punch so that we can begin to put them in binders. In the case of Trifles, on a weekly basis, that's 52 a year. And then, of course, iHose, which should be 24 annually since 2007. So that's 240 roughly. And I'm really looking forward to that. And once we've done all that printing, that collating, that organizing, I'm going to be the first one in line at the recycling center to make what I think is going to be the most memorable contribution they will have received.
So that's where your wife is sending you. That's where she's throwing you out to.
No, that's where she always carries me out every other Monday. Yeah. I keep coming back.
Oh, that's great.
Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 22 novels. The one he thought his best is an adventure story of knights and chivalry. 20-year-old Alan Edrickson travels the world encountering bullies, con artists, thieves, a damsel in distress, and 2 men who become his closest friends. Together they join the White Company, archers and fighters led by the gallant Sir Nigel Loring. Will our hero win the hand of Loring's romantic daughter Maud? Will the chivalrous Prince Edward restore Peter of Castile to his Spanish throne? Published in 1891 and never out of print, The White Company is a tale of pageantry and piracy, heraldry and hope, published now in an exclusive annotated edition with the original N.C. Wyeth illustrations in blazing color. Don't you owe it to yourself to read Conan Doyle's favorite book? Get the annotated White Company at wessexpress.com.
Dave Neale is the designer of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the Baker Street Irregulars, and the Sherlock Holmes scenario from Unlock, Heroic Adventures, and 5-Minute Chase from Board and Dice. He also has 6 more narrative mystery-solving games scheduled for release in 2021. And surprisingly, there are some that don't even include Sherlock Holmes. Outside of game design, Dave is a researcher and consultant in the psychology of play and learning, having earned his PhD from Cambridge University in 2017. He's held academic posts in the UK and USA and given research advice and briefings to the Lego Foundation, the UK Houses of Parliament, and the US military. He's an associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy and an affiliate of the Center for Research on Play in Education, Development, and Learning at the University of Cambridge, where he teaches the psychology of play. Dave Neale, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Hello.
Well, you are coming to us today from, Cambridge, England? Is that right?
Yep, Cambridge, England, yep.
Well, you must be steeped in the lore of Sherlock Holmes. When was the first time you remember encountering Sherlock Holmes as a child?
I can still sort of remember my first Sherlock Holmes book, hardcover book. I think I got it as a present off my aunt. I can still visualize the cover, this green cover, and the picture on the front. I might still even have it somewhere. And I can't remember exactly what age I was, but I was pretty young. I think I was probably younger than 10. And I quite quickly became sort of enthralled by Sherlock Holmes, and even within a few years of that point, I remember starting to invent my own kind of Sherlock Holmes stories and writing Sherlock Holmes plays, which I put on for my class at school with my friends acting in them. I don't think they would have held up very well to be very accurate in sort of canon terms, but it was a sort of a measure of my immediate sort of infatuation with Sherlock Holmes that I started doing that.
Well, that's impressive. I mean, usually we hear from our interview subjects that, they encountered Sherlock Holmes as children, sometimes through the books, sometimes through films, television, etc. But to actually go the extra step of writing your own, that's fairly rare. Were there like-minded literary folks in your family when you were growing up?
Well, my parents have always, I guess, been very into sort of creative things and into stories, into reading. My dad would tell us, read us stories at bedtime, and would also sometimes just make up stories for us as he went along, I think, at nighttime sometimes. So I guess sort of I was inspired by that, and I used to write a lot of stories and come up with sort of fictional worlds and things as a child a lot of the time. So once I discovered Sherlock Holmes, that's kind of the direction I was already sort of primed to go in, was to let my imagination run wild with this new idea I discovered.
That's fantastic.
Well, it's fascinating. And of course, what you're doing now was really just a part of what you do professionally. But in terms of the game, it really is a story. But what was the path for you to your academic pursuits? Because, you mentioned that you had created Sherlock Holmes plays when you were in school and your mates would join in. And obviously, play, creativity, storytelling, working with other kids, is clearly sort of central to, it seems like that's central to your interests and passions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I spent a long time kind of unsure where I fit in the world in a way, and what my direction was. But there were various things which have always fascinated me, which include sort of storytelling and creativity and play, and then the human mind, basically. So I at one point decided, well, I'm really interested in sort of the human mind and psychology and that, so I'll start going down that route and see where that takes me. And eventually that took me to a PhD in psychology, which ended up being about early psychological development and kind of the role of play in early development in childhood. And from there, I was writing the PhD, in fact, at the same time as I was writing the game that you have now got. Which ended up being longer than my PhD. So that was interesting comparison. I was doing the two things at the same time. I was writing my psychology PhD, and writing that game. And then since then, I worked in a lab in the US that's focused on research into play. And I've done some stuff about games and some talks about play and the psychology of play in adulthood. And so the two kind of things have kind of then merged in terms of my storytelling and sort of gaming and play side, and my research side have to some extent now become connected quite strongly. So this kind of worked out. It was more by accident than anything else, I think. It has.
That's fascinating. Well, we want to talk to you, obviously, mostly about the game. But before we do that, I'm just really curious. We've had a couple of guests on over the years where we've talked about psychology. For example, Maria Konnikova, who wrote a book, basically about how to think like Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, yeah.
She is, another psychology PhD who applied a lot of her early learning about William James and the birth of psychology to the structure of the book. I'm just curious, you must have applied some of the principles you've been researching professionally around play and psychology into the game. I mean, is there any way that, at a high level for ignorant, for lay readers like us, you could talk about some of those?
Well, there were some things I noticed that were kind of interesting designing a game as someone who was a psychologist as well. That were things like, for example, I realized that there's this well-known concept of flow in psychology, of getting into a flow state where you almost don't notice time passing because you're so engaged in an activity, and it's considered a important state for kind of well-being and things. And I realized that there's this sort of idea in gaming terminology about the magic circle, where you have a group who all become sort of engrossed and engaged in one thing and focused on that, and then time kind of passes without them realizing, and it's sort of a flow state, a collective flow state. It's almost like game design is about creating something that gives a group of people a collective flow state where they're all engaged in this immersive world, and time sort of just goes by without them realizing. So there are certain parallels like that. And then there's some stuff I think I used to do with, there's definitely relations between stuff I've looked at in psychology and learning about difficulty and providing a level of challenge which can kind of push people beyond what they normally can do. Getting the balance right of difficulty is an interesting challenge as a game designer. And I definitely have some links to some of the psychology stuff I have done. I mean, the Sherlock Holmes game that you've got is actually particularly difficult, but it's kind of almost made to be like that to sort of live up to the greatest detective of all time. The cases need to be difficult to live up to him, really. There was one other thing I was going to say related to that the psychology idea. Oh, it was one thing which I think is quite very interesting as well from a sort of detective point of view, is that I think designing these cases made me realize, and when I was testing them, is one thing that really stood out to me was how much crime solving and detection work, probably in the real world, I imagine, is about paying attention. And I'd never really thought about that before, but it was something that stood out to me when I was watching groups play this game, and that sometimes they would miss something, even something that was quite obvious. I would sometimes be like, okay, I've got to make this thing obvious in this clue because it's really important, and it'd be written there quite front and center, and somehow they would still miss it. And I realized that, of course, the game is giving the players quite a lot of information, and just the ability to stay focused, pick through that information, pick out the important details, is like 90% of solving something, I think. And I'd not really thought about it in that way before.
I think that's a great observation. And Dave, with the recent attention that's, pun intended, that's been given to situations like attention deficit disorder, and in your background in studying, childhood learning and development, do you see a role for games and gaming with respect to something like ADHD?
I know I haven't done a lot looking at things like ADHD in relation to playing gaming, but I do know that there is research on that area, and a lot of research about play is sort of looking at, well, what can it do that can sort of address some of the gaps in our current educational system? Are there ways that it can engage children who don't engage so well with our traditional educational system and give them opportunities for learning that they wouldn't otherwise have? So, so that is a big part of play, I think, because play is just almost universally engaging, and it therefore definitely represents an educational opportunity in certain ways.
Yeah. Well, there are so many games out there available for a wide variety of ages. In your research, and as you've studied, kind of human psychology across a variety of countries, what commonalities do you see across the human race and even across ages? Where does, I guess what I'm asking is, where does the psychology behind the enjoyment of a game perhaps change from a child's perspective to an adult's perspective? And do we approach playing games from different approaches, different perspectives as a child versus as an adult?
Yes, I mean that's a big question, but I think sort of as a brief kind of answer, I think yes, we do approach it differently. I think more generally, play as a child compared to play as an adult, which is something I've talked about before in sort of public talks and things, is that play as a child can be a very sort of open and freeform and flowing kind of thing. Children will kind of dip in and out of play all the time. You're sitting down for dinner in a restaurant, when we're allowed to do that kind of thing. You're sitting down for dinner in a restaurant, and there's they might just suddenly become a pirate for a bit, or something like that. Whereas if an adult did that, it would kind of be a bit probably seen as a little bit strange. So adults kind of have this more, they still play, but they do it in a much more circumscribed way. They do it in particular places, particular times, and in more elaborate ways often. You get you've got the rise of escape rooms that have become incredibly popular, which are basically a way for adults to play. Interactive theatre has become more and more popular, very kind of playful way of doing theatre. So, and then you have the live action role playing and these kind of events that go on where people dress up and do act out stories and things. So this is much more elaborate, potentially more complex, but it's very sort of discreet. This is us playing when you're an adult, whereas a child kind of dips in and out all the time. And so I think for a child, games as well can almost be like that. They're just part of the flow of things. Sometimes games almost blur into the rest of their life a bit, whereas for an adult, they're a bit more of a separate thing. And adults often have to sort of consciously put a time aside if they want to play a game, to fit it in their life. And they're like, okay, this is the time we're going to do this. And there's a bit more structure around how they fit play in, I think.
That's ironic that we have to take play more seriously as we grow up.
Yes, in a way, yeah. That's kind of that is part of it. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, it's almost like you have to plan for play, basically, because you have to plan a lot of your life, and there isn't really around that, I suppose, once you get to be an adult. But I mean, there are ways in which adults still sort of playful. That's another way that play comes out in adults. That's sort of different from in children. You do get this spontaneous play in adults, but it's more like, kind of a bit of joking, sort of quick sort of witty asides and laughing with friends and stuff. You get this kind of playful banter, that kind of thing coming out. So adults do that. They slip into that kind of sort of playful thing very easily, and often don't really see that as play, but it is really.
There are so many titles to choose from at MX Publishing that it's almost hard to cover all of them here. We've covered the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories quite frequently, but there are other smaller titles we think are just as worthwhile. One of those is Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland by Susan Knight. This was just published, and Susan actually did a book launch live from Dublin recently. You can find the link to the event on the mxpublishing.com site. There is a YouTube video there where the launch was done virtually. And if you're thinking about Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland, it's an extraordinarily well-researched book. You've got an engaging mystery, and there's an entertaining introduction to life in Victorian Ireland. Here, Holmes is believed to be dead somewhere at the bottom of Reichenbach Falls, so Mrs. Hudson has an opportunity to go gallivanting. She accompanies her friend and neighbor Kitty Melrose to Ireland, and there to rescue Kitty's godchild, Lily, from a suspected forced marriage. The two women are then found in a situation where it's everything they feared it might be, and in exchange for a parcel of land, Lily is going to be married against her will to a brutish neighbor. And it's only when that brutish neighbor is found stabbed to death on his wedding night with Lily standing over him that Mrs. Hudson is in the middle of all of it. But she's certain of Lily's innocence. If that sounds something like you'd enjoy, then you need to get over to mxpublishing.com and check out Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland by Susan Knight today. It's there, along with many other collections, just in time for the holidays. Go to mxpublishing.com and pick your favorite pastiche and more.
Well, let's talk a little bit. Well, let's not talk a little bit. Let's talk a lot about Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. For our listeners who may never have, I guess I should point out, this is the fourth in a series. I think it's the fourth.
Yep.
In a series of games that began in 2017, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. And there have been, three other, I think, editions. One is Thames Murders and Carlton House Park. And this is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, The Baker Street Irregulars, authored by Dave Neale. At a high level, just for our readers who may not be familiar with any of this, could you talk just a second about detective games, about that category, and about board games, and help them locate where this sort of fits in?
Yeah, okay. One thing is this, I think the version you mentioned, the 2017, that's the most recent publication, but the original Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective game came out in 1980, I think it's 81, maybe 82. And it was sort of in board game terms very much ahead of its time. It was soon after there was the whole role-playing Dungeons and Dragons thing happened in the 1970s, which put a focus on sort of games telling stories and things. And so that might have partly inspired it, but it was very unusual at that time. And it came out, and the basic principle of the game is that it's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes story, but divided into pieces. And so you begin by reading the introduction out loud, and you take some notes, and you have a map of Victorian London, and you have a directory with all names and addresses in, and you're deciding where you think you should go to find a clue to help you solve the mystery you've just been presented with. You decide where you're going, return to the entry in the book for that place and read what you find there, take more notes, and then repeat. And you keep doing this until you think you know what the solution to the mystery is. And then you turn to some questions like, who murdered this person? Why were they wearing long socks? Why this? All these strange questions and things. You try and answer them, and then you read the actual solution and see how well you did and get a score. So it was very original at that time, and there was nothing really else like it. And then it disappeared and went out of print a while after that. It was successful, I think, at the time, but it went out of print a while after. And then a publisher republished it in a version, I think, in about 2012. But then that And then the most recent version of that original set came out in 2017. But basically, after that came out in 2012, it was very successful, I think, and that has sparked a big increase in this whole idea of detective games that do this kind of thing, where you are essentially engaging in interactive narrative, solving a case. And there are now quite a range out there that do it in all different kinds of ways.
And when did you first get connected to it? Did you get connected to the series, early on, or when did you first encounter Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective?
Well, it would have been about, was it 2011 or 2012? Around that kind of time, I found it actually it was in a cupboard or in the attic at my dad's house. It was like this old battered copy from the 1980s, which we had evidently found at some like car boot sale type thing where they've been selling it cheap. And we'd evidently tried to play it when I was like young. But you could tell that we'd started trying to play it and then realized it was too difficult for, I don't know how old I was at that point, an 8-year-old or whatever. And it had been abandoned partway through. We'd written down some notes, but not got very far. But when I discovered it then and looked at it, I was like, wow, this looks pretty amazing. What is this game? And so looked at it and we ended up playing it and played the cases in that original set. And I really liked it. And then after that, I was just fascinated by that idea. And I just, a bit like coming up with the Sherlock Holmes plays when I was at school, I just thought of some cases myself, some ideas for some mysteries myself. And so I just wrote one out, and then kind of gave it to friends to play and see how they did. And at that point, it was just out of curiosity and for my own enjoyment. But then I saw that a publisher was republishing the game, and I sent them an email and said, I've written this case. If you've thought about doing some new stuff, here it is. And I continued and wrote another one or two or a few more. I began to develop a series of cases. And eventually, it took a long time, but quite a long time after that. It was over a year, I think. I got an email back from the publisher and it said, we've tried your cases. Can you do a whole box of 10 for us? So that was my entry into game design actually as a whole. And my and since then, are you still there? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, my Mac just I thought it had gone to sleep or was shutting down. It's okay. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so that was my kind of entry into board games in general, and I was very lucky because the publisher is a big publisher, so I was kind of getting in at a high level, and they were very keen on the cases I had written. They were very keen on. I made some changes to the rules and things, which I can tell you more about in a bit and things. But I made some changes, and yeah, they were really happy with it, and it kind of went on from there. And it's been a long process, been a long time coming out because that was 7 or 8 years ago. So, and it's only just come out this year, of course. So it has been a long process, but it's been an amazing process for me, actually.
Well, it's a great introduction to detective games, and I know really very little about detective games, although I have a box from a game from the that I played when I was very young that I thought was Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, but it's not, I don't think. But it was more but it also was oriented around cases. But
is it the 221B one?
Yes.
It's the one where you roll the dice, yeah, and you go around and you get little cards with some clues, yeah.
Yes, I've got that, but this is very different. So, as you say, what's in the box? It's a map of London with regions and locations. One of the lovely things is that everything is coded, so that by knowing the region and the building you want to visit, you can travel through the game. So that's a lovely immersive element. Mm-hmm. And as you say, there are 10 complete cases to play, and we'll probably ask you in a second, maybe to describe what some of those are about. There's a list of informants who can provide information. You have a London directory allowing you to find other people and businesses. And then very creatively, there's a morning Times. Each case has the morning edition of the Times for you to look at where you can find some interesting information. How many people is the game? What's the minimum and maximum number of people who can play?
Well, it's kind of, one is the minimum. People can play it on their own. It's pretty hard on your own. I think it's a game which is very useful to have somebody else to sort of bounce ideas off. And when I played the original game myself and in playtesting, there's been many, many times where one player has kind of fixated on a particular solution and gone, it's probably this, it's got to be this. And then someone else has pointed out a flaw in that idea. And if they've been playing on their own, they'd have just, gone down that dead end avenue, that wild goose chase or whatever. So it can be played alone. It's harder, I think. And then the limit, I think the publishers describe it as 1 to 8 even, but I mean, there's no hard limit. In theory, it could be almost any number of people, but it's kind of like, how many people can sort of comfortably have a conversation and meaningfully contribute to the discussion about what you should do next and, what you think the solution is. And so it's quite group dependent, I think. I think you could easily have a situation where someone who you could end up with somebody who wasn't really into it or didn't really like that kind of game or wasn't very confident and sort of wasn't really doing much and was just sitting there. If you have 2 or 3 people, that might be the kind of sweet spot. You've got some discussion, people aren't going to be left out. But I do know some people who've played in groups of 7 or 8 and they find it fine. So it does depend, I think, on who the people are.
Is there sort of an average amount of time? And I mean, you mentioned earlier you were watching groups play the game, so clearly you did some research along the way. Is there sort of an average time that you've observed that people tend to play? How long the game is?
Well, that varies a lot. I mean, the absolute minimum before people feel, one thing to say about it, which the listeners might not know, is that there isn't a set endpoint. Well, in most cases, there isn't a set endpoint. You play until you feel you know enough and might be able to solve the case and can answer the questions. So in theory, you could play for like 10 minutes and then decide to stop and go to the questions. You'll probably score very badly, but in theory, you could do that. So, but in reality, when you play, people tend not to feel they have almost any idea at all of what the might be going on until they've probably played for at least about 90 minutes. And then after that, I played some of the original cases and spent like 4 hours on them. But I have seen a comment from one group who played the last case in the box that you've got there and spent 32 hours playing it over a weekend. Which is really quite going to a whole other level. But yeah, so it's kind of like 90 minutes plus, and you kind of take as long as you feel you want to get as much information as you feel you need, and then you stop when you feel ready and you want to answer the questions.
Yeah. With the unfortunate pandemic that we have now, have you observed anybody playing this over Zoom with other people?
I know people are playing it over Zoom. The publisher actually on their website has materials for remote play that you can download, where you can download, I think it's the newspapers and the directory maybe, so that everybody can have those and can print them out in their house. And then one player has the main box and the books and reads those things, but everyone can look at the other materials. So it's quite popular, I think, to play over Zoom because it's relatively easy to do so. And I actually, at the start of the pandemic, I did play a case from one of the earlier cases, but I didn't write. I played one of those over Zoom, and it does work pretty well.
Huh. Can you describe some of the cases at sort of a high level for our listeners so they get a sense of what the stories are all about?
Yeah, so in this set, there are this set's called the Baker Street Irregulars, and the reason it's called the Baker Street Irregulars is because in the original game it tells you are the Baker Street Irregulars, but it doesn't really, apart from mentioning Wiggins sometimes and having him feature as a character, there wasn't much else about them or what they were kind of, who they were and stuff. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of put the focus more on them and who they were, and maybe make you feel more a part of that group than you did in the original game. So I decided to make that the focus of this. And as part of that, I also then decided I would make this chronologically the earliest. So the cases in this, out of all the different sets of this game, this starts the earliest in 1885, which is then the first case the Baker Street Irregulars have ever directly worked on for Holmes. And then the publisher decided, based on all that as well, that they wanted to try and get this set done well for kind of new players, people who'd never played before, because it's chronologically the first one. And so there were some changes in this one, like the sheet that shows all the informants you can visit for information that has pictures of them. That's new. There used to just be a list and things like that. So this has had some changes to make it a bit smoother for new players. So you have that first case they work on, which is a kidnapping, but a kind of slightly odd kidnapping, where the victim was released just after one night, and you have to figure out why that happened. There's a case following that, which is listeners may recognize parallels to a certain Sherlock Holmes story, where there is a severed finger that is discovered, and the basic mystery is, why is the severed finger even there? It's found in a box in the Thames by a mudlark, one of the Baker Street Irregulars called Tinker, who's a mudlark who looks for stuff in the river mud, and he finds this finger, and so the Irregulars just say, well, and it's got a tattoo on the side, and the Irregulars decide to try and figure out why this severed finger ended up in a box in the Thames. Then there's a case that is about a missing file that Mycroft gets stolen from Mycroft, and you have to kind of track it down. It's been stolen by a international spy. That case is a bit different than the two before it. And then the fourth case is very much focused on Wiggins, and that is also quite different in its tone, I guess. I mean, number 4 is it's a different kind of story in a way. I won't say too much not to spoil it, but it's also a bit more focused on kind of, it's a bit more emotional, I think. I did have one person write to me saying she found it incredibly emotional at the end, and was one of her most emotional experiences playing a board game. So that was quite meaningful to me, because I was kind of hoping, I wanted to kind of create an emotional experience in that particular case. So they're the first 4, and they're all quite different. Number 3 and number 4 are both very different from each other, in fact, both very different experiences. So they cover a range of stuff. And then the next set of cases after that, the number 5 to 10, then cover a whole other range of things, of like heists, and strange codes on newspapers, disappearances. And with those ones, there is also some connecting thread. When you get to the end of them all, in case 10, you will realize there are some certain things that link stuff together. And the final case is like a big finale, with a lot of stuff going on that gives you a sort of overall resolution to the whole set, basically.
So it's a wonderful architecture. You know, we should tell our listeners that, you as the player decide where to go and how long you want to play. And if you get stuck at any point, there's some very clever things. You can visit 221B and consult Sherlock Holmes. Get a hint. There's a point score at the end, and Holmes always scores 100 and explains the solution. But it's possible to do better than Holmes. And unfortunately, if you're not as acute as Sherlock, who is, if you follow more leads than Sherlock Holmes to get to the solution, you lose points. But it's the role of Sherlock Holmes in the game structure is really nicely done, I think.
Yeah, that's been helped a lot by, I mentioned earlier some changes I'd made. One of the changes compared to the original version of the game that I added was this tracking system where you circle letters. So you will sometimes go somewhere, and when you've gone to a certain place, it will say circle the letter A, and you have a sheet which has the alphabet written on it for that case. So it will say case 1, the Curzon Street kidnapping, and it will have the alphabet written out. And so you've gone somewhere, it says circle the letter A, you circle it. And then when you go somewhere else in that case, it might say, is A circled? If it isn't, you don't learn anything here or whatever. If it is, read on. And so basically, if you learn one piece of information somewhere, it might change what you learn somewhere else. So for example, you might go somewhere and be told that someone called Colonel Smethering is really important in this case. And so when you go to a different place, it will say, do you have A circled? Yes, you do. So then it will say, we ask about Colonel Smethering. Obviously, if you don't have A circled, you don't ask about him because you don't know about him. And that was partly to solve a problem in the original, which was that sometimes, because the original didn't have that, it would assume you had been to certain places. And so, but you wouldn't always have. Sometimes you'd leapt ahead to doing something for whatever reason, and you'd gone somewhere the game wasn't expecting you to go so quickly. And so you would suddenly be asking about a character, and you'd be like, who's that? Why are we asking about this person we've never heard of before? So this circled letter system where the game, it sort of gives the game a memory. It knows where you've been in a way, solved that problem, and also allowed me to make Sherlock Holmes kind of more useful in the hints he can give, because when you go to Sherlock Holmes, the game knows how far along you are. So by the circled letters you have. So if you have a lot of the circled letters, certain ones, then it will know you're sort of that you know a huge amount, and it will tell you a clue that will help you towards the end. Whereas if you have almost nothing circled, it might know that you know very little, and it will give you an initial clue to help you at the beginning. So that was definitely a useful way of giving players more hints.
He's an author. He's a blogger. He is a fancier of bow ties. That's right. You're talking about our friend Dan Andriacco, the creator of the Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody mysteries. Why, if you haven't been to danandriacco.com, you're missing out. There are reviews of publications from all over the Sherlockian world, as well as commentary on, games and puzzles and lots of different things. And of course, access to Dan's oeuvre of Sherlockian work, including Murderer's Row. There's no holiday from homicide for Sebastian McCabe and his long-suffering brother-in-law, Jeff Cody. And Murderer's Row is their second casebook of shorter stories, and it's got 3 adventures that are connected with what otherwise would have been happy occasions. Well, the happy occasion of the holidays is coming up, so if you go to danandriacco.com, you can choose what you'd like to get from Dan in time for the holidays, perhaps for those Sherlockians you know that like related tales. There's Murderer's Row, Too Many Clues, Queen City Corpse, Aaron Go Bloody, the 1895 murder, No Police Like Holmes, that's the book that started it all, and many more. Just go to danandriacco.com and tell them iHose sent you. When you're designing a game, and you've worked on this for Sherlock Holmes, I know we want to talk about what you've got in the future in just a moment, but when you're designing a game, what was different for you about designing a game around Sherlock Holmes versus other games that you've created?
Well, if this game you've got now was my first real game. I mean, I did design games when like that play. As a child, I designed games, and I always played games with my brother. We'd play a lot of games and invent games and things. But in terms of like actual designing games as work, this was my entry point. So, and in a sense, it's become it's almost normal. It's almost my base line is Sherlock Holmes in a game. So it's kind of the opposite of the way you phrased it in a way. Because in terms of other things I've got coming up, there are some other things that also involve Sherlock Holmes, and that's kind of become my thing to some extent. So I guess it almost took me a bit of time, I guess, to find a different way of doing narrative games, I suppose, because this is a very in-depth narrative game. You experience a very detailed, intricate story and a plot, and you interact with it. And I thought that was great. And I could kind of instinctively feel that there was more in that principle than obviously just Sherlock Holmes related things, and more than just detective things. Probably, you can tell other kinds of stories. And I suppose I had to sort of feel my way into a broader spectrum of like, okay, how can I create storytelling games in different ways that do different things about different subjects that aren't always about solving crimes and this kind of thing. So I had to sort of leave Sherlock Holmes behind rather than find him, because it's always going to be for me, like Sherlock Holmes and board games design are always going to be kind of inextricably linked, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. It makes sense. So tell us a little bit about what else you're working on, the other games that are in the queue for 2021.
Well, there's a game called Unlock, which is an escape room card game. So it's like an escape room you do at home, where it's a deck of cards, and you also use an app on your phone, which you can enter some codes and things into the app, and then the app will tell you to draw new cards, and the cards kind of show rooms and places, and so it's a bit like an escape room type experience where you're solving puzzles and things, but you do it in your own home. And I've actually already got it's a whole series of games, and I've designed one scenario for the series already, which came out in 2018. Which was also Sherlock Holmes themed, which is called Sherlock Holmes: The Scarlet Thread of Murder, but it's in a box called Unlock Heroic Adventures is the actual name of the box. It contains 3 different scenarios, and mine is one of them. So I've done another Sherlock Holmes themed one of these scenarios, escape room scenarios, which is coming out in probably around summer 2021. And then in addition to that, I've got a Sherlock Holmes game, which is, in a sense, I mean, the original idea was to make something like the game you've got, but more pitched for children and families, because sort of like maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 year olds, that kind of age and up, maybe something that would be enjoyable for adults and parents, but also very engaging for kids. So there is that game, which will be coming out, I think, probably towards the end of next year, maybe September next year, which is, I think I'm allowed to say, I did ask the publisher a while ago, and they did say I could discuss this game, I think. So it's called Toby and the Animals of Baker Street. So that is essentially this type of experience, but made kind of simpler and written for children. And with that, I've worked with my friend Clementine Beauvais, who is a children's author, and we've written that together. So that's quite an exciting one too. And then there are a few others, but I don't know if you want to hear about all of them. But I've got various narrative games coming out next year, some that don't involve Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, that's exciting. And it strikes me as we were talking earlier in the interview about the difference between the way children approach play and the way adults approach it, that there's this free form versus structured type of play. And as you've just been describing the types of games that you're involved with, it sounds like you too have things that have to do with structure. The Sherlock Holmes Consulting game, that's kind of a known pattern, a known process that people go through with these games. And then there are other games that you're coming up with kind of free form out of your own head. How do you balance that? Like you have to color within the lines within a certain group, and then you have the ability to just create your own. Which is there a preference that you have, and how do you approach that?
They're sort of quite different. I mean, I guess one thing about doing the Consulting Detective and with the Unlock escape room games, again, that was sort of, like you say, coloring in the lines in a way. I was working with the sort of game system that had already been designed. So in a sense, that's kind of quite liberating, because it's already there and you kind of know you've got something that works, and it's more like, okay, what can I do with this? What stories can I tell with this that are really interesting and new? And then also, are the things I can do that are different like with the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, Baker Street Irregulars, with the circling of the letters, so the game knows what you've done and what you know. So you have this kind of like, in a way, it's kind of sort of, in a sense, faster because you can get straight in there and don't have to think about how the game's going to work overall. And then you can also figure out sort of how to push the system a bit and add things and change things around. I mean, I say faster, but the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective game you've got is probably the longest time I've worked on a game, and maybe the longest time I ever work on a game. I'm not sure, but it took a long time. Just the sheer amount of writing and testing and planning and all that kind of stuff. But then when you come up with it completely yourself, I guess there's an excitement there, and it's like, well, just because of what's possible, it's like what's going to work for this audience. What kind of things can I do? What kind of stories can I tell? And I guess I've discovered as I've gone along that you will often, it sometimes initially feels relatively straightforward to come up with a system for telling a story in some way. What you'll often find is that you relatively quickly get to a point where you're suddenly like, oh, well, I want the story to do this, to have these options. And you realize there's no way for the game system you come up with to give those options. And so then you have to think about it again, and you get a challenge of like a sort of solving the puzzle of, well, okay, how can I put those options in there? And you kind of want to try and avoid overloading the player with too many rules to think of and this kind of stuff, because especially if it's a story game primarily, they often want to really be engaged in the story and focus on the story. You don't want them thinking too much about numbers and all these rules they have to remember and stuff like that. So you've got to get this balance right. You've got to sort of use the game system to tell the story and design it to tell the story and the kind of story you want to tell for the audience you want to tell. So that's the challenge, and it's an interesting one.
Sounds like a puzzle to work out on your own there.
Yeah, definitely.
Dave, you've got so much experience. I have to ask you, how do you play? I mean, when you've got some free time, do you grab your golf clubs? Do you pick a deck of cards, play poker? Do you turn on the Xbox? Do you go out and play football? How do you, can you still play with everything you know about all this? I think in general, I'm often quite a playful person. I kind of look for opportunities to play a lot of the time when other people don't. And I think I'm sometimes playful in just the way I interact with people in certain situations. But I play a lot of board games, and I'm fascinated by board games. I guess I'm fascinated by the way they sort of create worlds and can create how you can sort of model almost a kind of a different reality with just sort of cardboard a lot of the time is something I just find quite fascinating as a principle. And so, I love playing new games and seeing how they work. A whole load of different type of games, a lot of games that are not anything like the games I design. I'm also interested in playing games like the ones I design, like narrative games, and seeing how they do things. I do still very much play games. I play video games sometimes, although not as much as board games. I very much like the social aspect of board games. That's a big thing for me. I think that interaction, and ideally in a COVID-free world, the sort of the face-to-face interactions you get from board games, I find great and very kind of invigorating for me to experience. So I think social play is a big thing for me.
Yeah, as we've been spending more time together as a family here during the pandemic, we've turned to board games, and we have a series of games in the Ticket to Ride series of games. We find that a lot of fun.
Yeah, they're good.
So, now, Dave, just in closing, help us think through your observations as a trained psychologist when you look at the canon, the 60 stories that Conan Doyle wrote. Which of these stories tend to lend themselves to a game-like mentality? In other words, can you think through some where we're following along with Holmes, or it seems like we have some more clues at our hand and are able to take charge of it more than others?
I think there are definitely a range where there are definitely some that are more open to us sort of solving it ourselves versus not being able to. There's definitely that range in there. I'm trying to think of particular examples at the moment. I think there are some that have particularly good. I don't know. I guess there are some that have particularly nice. There's one that I've always liked, and I don't know if it gets that much general appreciation. Is The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire? I think the solution is quite neat for how strange the original problem looks. The solution is pretty neat.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm quite a fan of that kind of thing, where you have some bizarre situation and you think, what can this be about? And then you get a solution and it's actually like, oh, it was actually something relatively simple in a way. But it just looked really odd because of the perspective you're looking at it from.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool. And I think I can't think of any others offhand, but there are other stories that do that, where something seems inexplicable and it's because of the perspective you're looking at it from. Yeah. And I've tried to get that in a lot of the cases in the game as well, as much as I can. And I often started almost from the point of saying of thinking to myself, what would be a weird situation? What would be a weird thing? If somebody said to me, this thing happened and I don't understand why, what would that be? And I came up with some things like that. And then once I'd come up with them and I thought, yeah, that'd be weird, I'd have no idea why that happened. Then I tried to think of a reason, and then that became a case. So yeah. That's the kind of thing I like. And I think the canon has got multiple examples of that. And The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire is just one of them.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me, it was a bit of a difficult question, an impossible question to ask in some ways to answer. Conan Doyle in his masterful storytelling, has done a better job just with narrative and good storytelling than he has with trying to solve a puzzle. Typically, the stories aren't structured in a solve your own adventure kind of way. And you make a great point about the Sussex Vampire. I think The Hound of the Baskervilles is another one where we're greeted with the supernatural, something that doesn't seem believable. Mm-hmm. But in your opinion, as Conan Doyle has approached his storytelling, are there any places where the psychology breaks down, where we find ourselves with someone who has an unbelievable reaction to something, or does Conan Doyle capture the human psychology fairly well?
I think he generally captures it fairly well. I mean, it's definitely often pushed a little in terms of how Holmes can interpret things and deduce people's sort of feelings or thoughts based on their actions. But in terms of kind of how characters are presented and their reactions and general motivations, I think on the whole, my experience of the canon, I find it largely believable, and I think at least more believable than a lot of detective fiction since. I think in a sense he was sort of more restrained and kind of managed to keep a bit more of a handle on realism than some detective stuff that has proliferated since, like some modern detective things and stuff, which I think sort of perhaps in an effort to try and find new stuff, you get some things just pushing people's psychology and motivations and for crimes to quite an extreme, because I guess it's such a crowded genre now that people just they want to try and do new things, and it gets difficult.
It's fascinating. It's just it's a whole other world, and it's wonderful. But the other thing is, it's an interesting set of questions when you talk about Conan Doyle and the narrative structure, and you mentioned this, Dave, earlier. You said, this is just an enormous amount of writings. There are 10 cases here. When you sit down to author a game. Conan Doyle used to complain that coming up with the plots was always the toughest part. But when you sit down to author something like this, since you really are writing a collection of stories, do you start with, what do you start with? Do you start with the strange events? Do you start with the end? How does it compare to writing, just producing a book or producing a short story?
Oh, I think it's very similar in terms of, I think, as I mentioned, sometimes I'll start with the strange event. I'll think, well, that's strange. Can I think of a good explanation for that feels satisfying but unexpected? And if I then eventually can, I'll be like, okay, that can work. I'll take that as the basis. Sometimes it's more the end. Sometimes I will realize something. It will just occur to me while I'm doing something else in the day. I'll notice something and think, oh, it could be interesting to have a case based around that. Someone, I'll realize that you can work out something based on the way something is happening in a certain room or the way somebody moves, or I don't know. But there are certain things you might notice in your day-to-day life and be like, oh, that could be the good basis for a mystery in some way. And so from there, it's then expanding that out into a story, and which I guess is pretty similar to writing a sort of collection just of standard stories. And then I guess where it gets different is the fact that you then have to think, how will players see this? Is it possible to actually work this out without having, read everything, without getting to the solution? What are the pieces that players can use to put this together? And it has to, you realize quite early on trying to do this kind of thing that players can be very unforgiving of like plot holes or anything. So you just cannot have plot holes. You really have to avoid them. And that's where play testing comes in, when you give it to players and watch them play. And sometimes they'll find a plot hole, and then I'm like, okay, right, now I have to rewrite and address that plot hole and cover that up, because players will be frustrated because they've been told, here's something you can solve. And if they find out a plot hole, which means they can't solve it, then they feel cheated. So there's something very strict about that in terms of how you have to put it together. And then there's also the fact that because you want players to have freedom, you have to not just have the story that you would have if you're writing a short story. You have to have all the other bits around that. So in a standard Sherlock Holmes story, you won't necessarily, ever meet the client's wife or go to the place where he works. But in this game, the players have to have the options to do those things, which means I have to now write a thing about what his wife says and what you find at his work, and all this extra stuff that might not actually be directly related to the case, but I've still got to write it. And so, there's this whole extra element to it.
Well, thank you for creating, such a magnificent addition to the world of Sherlock Holmes, such a great immersive experience in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the Baker Street Irregulars.
Thank you.
Well, I have to tell you, it's not often that games, especially Sherlockian games, come into my purview. Our family has been playing a lot of games during the pandemic, as I mentioned during the interview, and just last weekend we had a wonderful time, trying some new games, and it's easy to go back to the tried and the true and the things we've grown up with and whatnot, but you walk into any specialty game store and look on the shelves, and it's absolutely remarkable. The different styles and types of games that they have today that really seem to be only limited by the imaginations of the creators.
Yeah, that's a terrific observation. And I'm such a big fan of games. In fact, when my kids were younger, we had an enormous collection of games that we played. But what I found interesting, and you're absolutely right when you talk about the imagination of the creator. But what I found really interesting in what Dave had to say, among everything Dave had to say, was the psychological aspect of it, because I never realized before the relevance and alignment with popular culture. So in his conversation, you can relate games, and particularly this particular game, to things like escape rooms, which he mentioned, to interactive theater, which he mentioned, to cosplay, to people who, and the rise of that. And I never realized before that it's all of a piece, that participatory engagement, interaction with games. And that's one of the things that makes this particular game, I think, so successful.
Yeah, and at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily locked into these current trends. I mean, these current trends are certainly something that are representative of everything that's happening around us now. But at the same time, they're very much universal. This notion of an escape room, even though the construct is of a modern era, the concept itself is rooted in, look, go all the way back to Dickens or Poe, the kind of locked room mystery kind of thing that we've enjoyed for centuries now. So I think, when you combine that kind of current event or the current trends with something like Sherlock Holmes, the Consulting Detective, again, it's a timeless classic. I think something that will certainly last well beyond what we're seeing in these few years around us.
Yes, as long as we last for some time after everything we're seeing in these years around us.
We can only hope. Well, you've heard those strains of music before. If you haven't, and you're a first-time listener, welcome. This is the time in our show when we talk about, or when we cover, canonical couplets. That's right. It's every Sherlockian's favorite quiz game, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we expect you to come up with the title of the story that is represented by those 2 lines. Now, if you remember, the last time we were here, we gave you this clue. £4 a week when business was slow was more than worth the Fleet Street show. Bert, do you know the solution to this episode's canonical couplet?
I got this one. This one I got. It's the story of the mysterious legend about the exploding sporting equipment. This is the sound of the basketballs.
Boing, boing. Yes. Bert, I think you should concentrate on your dribbling.
That's what my dry cleaner says.
Well, as usual, Bert, you were so close yet so far away. Our friend Eric Deckers had a suggestion for you. He said, I'm sure I've got it this time. This was the story about a man named Jabez Garcia who was hired to copy lyrics from the Terrapin Station album. It's the Grateful Dead-Headed League. No, that's not right. It's the Red-Headed League. It's the Red-Headed League. And we do appreciate your help with this every week, Eric, but we're going to still go to the wheel, the great prize wheel, and we're going to haul it out here and give it a big spin, and we'll watch it go around. And it's slowing down, and it looks like it lands on number 12. Number 12. And that corresponds to Richard Nunn. Richard from California, congratulations. We will be reaching out to you and sending you a prize of some sort. You'll have to stay tuned for what it is. But in this case, we have a prize available for this episode's canonical couplet. The prize, in this case, is a copy of David Neale's Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the Baker Street Irregulars. And here's your clue. Watson, down for breakfast, had no idea at all he'd soon be off to Paddington to answer Sherlock's call. If you know the answer to this episode's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers that we receive and we choose your name at random, you will win a copy of the game. Good luck. Oh boy, that's going to be a lot of fun receiving those answers. I have no doubt. It's a tricky one, too.
Interesting, yes.
Yeah. Well, what do you have planned between now and the middle of the month, Bert?
Well, wrapping and unwrapping Christmas presents.
The same ones? You're going to wrap them and unwrap them? And
yeah, it's part of my skill building.
Lather, rinse, and repeat. Yeah.
Lather, rinse, and repeat.
Well, we need to keep ourselves occupied in these trying times. Certainly one way to do it.
It's true. Well, I have a lot of writing assignments and things, but it's such a bizarre year. Everything that's been going on in 2020 has really upset so many cycles and so many rhythms. What do you have going on between? Have you done all your Christmas shopping? I've done probably about, I would say, half of my Christmas shopping.
Yeah, I've done most of mine. Obviously, it's an online affair this year, as so many things are, which, makes it a little easier. We're, I think, talking about travel or non-travel plans for the holidays, given what the situation is. I think the biggest thing left is to kind of figure out what it is that we'll be eating around the holidays and prepare our menus for that time period. So we'll have fun with that.
Don't you have a sort of a standard menu that you generally refer, or is it really different every year?
No, we vary it every year. For the big Christmas dinner, we've done everything from crown roast of pork to prime rib to ham to turkey. I can't seem to convince my family to try goose, though, unfortunately.
We did do a goose at least once and maybe twice. It wasn't the Friends of Irene Adler experience. And that's an annual event that will sadly not be held this year in Massachusetts in the third Friday of December, which I guess is when it was usually held, but or the second, I don't quite remember.
Third Friday, yeah.
But the dinner there was always goose, and it was always great. But we failed to duplicate that. So you're not missing anything.
No, it's not quite the same at home anyway. Well, whatever it is you're preparing, happy first half of the month to you. We will be back here on December 15th with episode 206, and that means we'll only have one episode left for 2020. We're lining up our guests. There's plenty to be had for 2021, but we do appreciate you staying tuned here with everything that we offer at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Interviews twice a month with Sherlockian luminaries. In the meantime, I am the brightly shining, I don't know if I'd say luminary, Scott Monty.
And I am the dull, patinaed Bert Wolden.
And together we combine our wattage to say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.